Kada ste uhapšeni u oktobru mjesecu 2001. godine, to je otprilike bilo nekih mjesec dana nakon napada u Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama, terorističkih napada u Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama. Recite mi, ste ikad mogli pomisliti na to da ćete skoro 7,5 godina provesti nevinu u zatvoru?
Ja stvarno nisam, ja sam iznenadio da ću biti jedan od tih osoba koji će biti optužen. Zašto ja svaki put prođem kroz američku ambasadu. Ja sam stanovao u Vogošće, koji znaju Vogošće, a bio sam trener u Zetra, a radio sam kod na Grbavici dole. Pa znači, najmanje 3-4 puta moram preći kroz američku ambasadu.
To je bilo jedno od glavnih pitanja istražitelja. Zašto često prolazite pored američke ambasade? To je bila osnova sumnje protiv vas. A vi ste to morali zato što ste trenirali na Zetri, ali tako? Vi ste odličan karatista, a živjeli ste u Vogošći i ne postoji drugi put zapravo do američke ambasade.
Ja sam stanovao u Vogošći, prije nek bila američka ambasada, bila neki, turski, neki bataljon i prije toga bio neki, ja mislim, vrti nište bio tamo.
U januaru mjesecu dolaze po vas u centralni zatvor u Sarajevu i u Guantanamu, dakle punih 7 godina. Prve optužbe bile su da ste pripremali terorističke napade na ambasadu Sjedinjenih Američkih Država i ambasadu Velike Britanije. Međutim, to je vrlo brzo promijenjeno. Onda su vas optuživali da ste se spremili da putujete u Afganistan. I šta su oni zapravo od vas još tražili?
Kaže, Mustafa, ti si ovdje da nama daješ informacija. Rekao sam zašto? Kaže, Arapi koji žive u Bosni i Hercegovini, islamske humanitarne organizacije koje radi u Bosni i Hercegovini, ja sam bio u nekim mjestima na neka izolacija, više od 5-6 mjeseci. Nisam znao da je dan ili noć. Ne znam. Apsolutno. Vjeriti, moje ruke ne mogu vidjeti. Toliko ima račeno. Visina, na plafonu su stavili svjetlo, 3 niona, dugi koliko ima metar i po, ne znam, koliko tuđi, 24 sata opaljen. Ne smiješ spavati, zabranjeno je spavanja i da ostaviš ruku ovako. Znači kad spavaš, ne smiješ staviti ruku.
Carlota, pomenuli smo na početku, dakle vi ste prvi koji ste došli do priče o ubistvima koji su se događale u američkoj vojnoj bazi Bagram. Kakve su reakcije vaših urednika, kako su oni reagirali na to i kako su pažnju posvetili vašoj priči?
I was a war reporter. I reported here in the Balkans before and in Chechnya before. And I was used to finding stories and writing them, and they would go out. And this story, people doubted my reporting. I knew 2 guys had died in Bagram because the Americans announced that. And they said it was natural causes. So just natural journalistic curiosity, I wanted to find these guys. A bit like Tim, I wanted to see, well, who were they? What were they? Why were they fighting? Or what were they terrorists? What sort of people were they? And when I got to the family of one, they had the death certificate. And that's where I saw on the death certificate it said homicide. And it said that there were injuries to the man's legs, which caused a heart attack. So I remember thinking, oh my God, they killed him. And that immediately it became a different story. It became a story of mistreatment by American soldiers. And there was just a reluctance with my editors, and it took a long time. I think it was 4 weeks between when I first filed the story until it ran. Anyway, it did run, but it ran on page 14, and I think some of us in the paper thought it should have been on page 1.
Well, I wasn't really one of the first to write about it. I think one of the striking things is that people had written about Guantanamo. Press had covered Guantanamo all from the very beginning.
But I sensed also a sort of patriotism in America that caused a certain hesitation after 9/11 for some stories.
So Tim, what kind of impact this kind of stories actually made to policymakers?
Well, I don't think we should overestimate the impact. Actually, can I just add one thing to what Carlota said? I think the other thing that's very important about Bagram, even more so than Guantanamo, in some ways, is that it was a situation in which the suspension of the Geneva Conventions had an enormous impact. in Guantanamo, it was a very small and controlled environment, and it was very hard for people to do things abusively, or it's harder. In Bagram, there was nobody watching, and I think part of what happens in Bagram has to do with the Geneva Convention very directly, the suspension of the conventions. In terms of the impact, I think it all had an impact, but it's part of a broader context of Abu Ghraib, of the problems in Iraq, the reasons that the government gave for war in Iraq turning out to be almost entirely based on false intelligence, and the impact, I think, was slower than you would hope. People in the country at large are maybe not making their decisions as much as they used to based on information that comes out in places like the New York Times.
Guantanamo hasn't been still closed, although there were the promises and the laws and the decisions about that. Bagram still exists. The conditions are better. There are at least 15,000 people detained in Afghanistan in very bad conditions all over the country. I mean, what were actually the results? Tim, is that frustrating, talking about your work, amazing work of the other journalists, amazing work of the media, discovering all these things?
Well, I don't think it. I wouldn't give us so much credit.
Sure.
I think some people have done very good work, a lot among them from the early days. But, there's not, a lot of it probably tell you that there are fewer and fewer American and Western European reporters covering Afghanistan, even as the war gets bigger. And I think some of those people pay attention to what's happening at Bagram, but it takes time and it takes a lot of persistence to find out what's really happening. And I think Bagram has been very undercover. People can fly to Guantanamo for 2 days, and then there's a tour that they give you. This is a little bit documented in the film. But I think the country's attention has not been the United States' attention has not been so sustained. And I think the fact that Obama has been unable to close Guantanamo has also had to do with how the politics have changed in the United States. Guantanamo has become more of a political issue rather than less, unfortunately.
But Tim, you were the one actually who wrote, because of all this criticism in the media, and it was written in 2008, I believe, that you mentioned also that in your speech in Harvard, that if George Bush could have, he would close Guantanamo in 2008.
Yeah, I think he would have, and I said publicly in 2009 that I did not think Obama was going to close Guantanamo in a year. I think we didn't anticipate that the Republican Party used Guantanamo quite as it did, but Guantanamo, the war on terrorism is a little bit like the war against communism or the war on drugs. It's now a subject that the Republicans say, the Democrats are soft on terrorism. They want to bring these Guantanamo terrorists to the United States. They don't understand how dangerous they really are. I mean, anybody who pays attention to this issue can see that there's very dangerous people in every state in the United States, extremely dangerous people, and they're in jail and they stay in jail. But this has become a political issue in this way, and now at a kind of a local level in cities and states, there's great opposition to. We don't want these people moved to our town or to our state to be held in the United States, so that Guantanamo could be closed.
For both of you, actually. Okay. So my question is for both of our journalist and guest tonight, and it's more related to this overall developments with the media and the war on terror and general aspect of it. And I'll try to summarize. I had two very different personal experiences. Living in New York and watching September the 11th happening, and then living in England and seeing the London bombing happening. And two entirely different public reactions, two entirely different media roles, and two very different procedures in terms of the follow-up of the acts of the government, in terms of patriot acts and everything else. And I try to explain to myself and keep asking people what caused these two totally opposite reactions. Is it the media? How media reacted to it? Is it what the government wanted to make out of the terrorist acts that happened, and both of them? But I found the reaction in England much calmer, and media reacted to it in an entirely different manner comparing to the American media. Of course, I'm not trying to compare these two acts and the magnitude of them, but also the follow-up of these acts was different, and the perception of people was different. What both of you see as the main reasons creating these two different situations? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I'm British, you probably realize, so I would say just briefly, 7/7 was nothing like as big or as bad, and the British have had a long 30 years of IRA bombings. I grew up with them. You know, I remember being evacuated, and I was working in the city when it got bombed. And the British have an attitude of get on with it. And I think we learnt with the IRA bombings that you can just carry on. And sure, there's loss of life, but life goes on. I think there was, 9/11 was just something altogether completely different in shock value and size, and but Tim can talk more about that. Sorry, just secondly, clearly the politics was different. The British government was under Tony Blair was just completely different from the Bush government, and I think that, as you say, had a lot to do with it.
No, I think that's exactly right. I don't think it was the media that presented it in a certain way. I think the Bush administration presented 9/11 as the discovery of an existential threat to the United States, that Islamist terrorism could destroy our country. And, they did not, there was not an effort to put things in perspective. There was an effort to sort of say, this is the beginning of a war that will last our lifetimes. Now the United States is much more concerned with figuring out ways to create the kind of strategic patience and resilience that countries like Britain and other countries that have lived with terrorism for a long time have almost intuitively now, and people understand. This is a problem, this is a threat, but it's of a different order. It's not going to end the world.
Moram nešto dodati, tek toliko da podsjetim publiku ovdje, da je izvještavanje BiH dana o cijeloj ovoj situaciji sa alžirskom grupom bilo drugačije u odnosu na druge medije te 2001. i 2002. godine. Ja mislim da se svi zajedno moramo prisjetiti pod kakvim je pritiskom bio predsjednik tadašnjeg Helsinškog komiteta, odnosno tadašnji predsjednik Helsinškog komiteta za ljudska prava u Bosni i Hercegovini, Srđan Dizarević. Također treba da podsjetim da je Dom za ljudska prava ekspresno donio odluku da se ovi ljudi ne smiju izručiti i da su povređena njihova ljudska prava, dakle da je bilo izvještaja te vrste. I nešto što mislim da smo svi zanemarili, zaboravili, dakle, podudarao se sa vremenom kad je Tim Golden počeo da izvještava o Guantanamu na način koji je objašnjavao tokom ove večeri da je tih 1500 dokumenata, odnosno papira koji su izašli u javnost iz vojnih obavještajnih službi i koje prezentiraju između ostalog i Associated Press, došlo do novinara BH Dana Esada Hećimovića i koga interesuje vrlo jednostavno pretragom u Mediacentru može da dođe do tih vrlo zanimljivih svjedočenja, pri čemu je Hećimović prije svega fokusirao se na iskaze naših ljudi, bosansko-hercegovačkih državljana koji su bili zatočeni u Guantanamu, dakle njih 6, pri čemu je još pronašao neke koji su također bili optuženi, odnosno sumnjičeni za terorizam.